Hello, I'm Jeremy, the host of Examining Life, and welcome to episode 2 of the first European Buddhist, The Philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer. The German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer is known as two things. First, he is considered the father of pessimistic philosophy, the face matches the description. Second, he was the first ever European Buddhist. Over the course of this series, our goal is to make these two lofty titles make sense. To do so, we're breaking Schopenhauer's philosophy down into parts, episode by episode. Each episode answers a key part of the puzzle in his philosophy, including, but not limited to, why you are anxious and depressed. Seriously, why no amount of happiness could outweigh the suffering of life, why this world is so horrible that it would be better off had it not existed, and perhaps most importantly, the way to face life in the midst of rampant and inevitable suffering. From this short introduction, you might already have a sense of why Schopenhauer is considered the father of pessimism. But to understand why he makes the claims that he does, most famously the claim that the world is so horrible that it ought not to exist, we're going to have to understand his metaphysics. That is, we first need to understand what Schopenhauer takes to be the basis of reality. That will be the focus of this episode. In this episode, expect to learn the answers to questions such as, what is the difference between the representation of an object and the object itself? Is everything we experience a representation? And can we know what underlies our existence? The titles of Schopenhauer's books alone tell us the basis of what we need to understand. His magnum opus is called The World as Will and Representation. He wrote this book early in his philosophical career, and he liked it so much that he basically re-released the same work twice more throughout his career. The title, The World as Will and Representation, tells us what we need to get going. First, that there is a world. Secondly, that this world has two parts, will and representation. Now, we need to specify what will and representation are. Before I get to that, however, if you enjoy videos like this that make philosophy accessible without dumbing it down, I would really appreciate it if you take a few seconds out of your day to just like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to my channel. It really helps small YouTubers like me who are getting started, so thank you, it means a lot. Let's get back to the video. The primary aim of this video will be to make sense of what the world as representation means. I think the best way to present this idea is through an analogy, at least at first. For the sake of the analogy, let's say that you're somebody who's really curious about global news. The issue is, you live in a totalitarian government that controls three sources of news, the three sources that you have access to. They give you a podcast, which you listen to on your daily commute. They release infographics, which fill your social media feed, and they publish articles, which you read in your free time. In this scenario, you, the subject, are striving to know about some external object. In this case, global news. One day, you hear that the government's news may not be all that reliable. As you think more about it, you realize that all your access to information about the world is indirect, mediated by the government. Therefore, each of the three news sources, the podcast, infographics, and journal, are likely to be biased, incorrect, or incomplete in some respects. Upon realizing that your acquaintance with global affairs is indirect, mediated by the government, you ask yourself the following question. Do I know anything about global affairs itself, or do I just understand how the government represents global affairs? Now take a second to pause and try to come up with an answer. I'll ask the question again. Do I know anything about global affairs itself, or do I just understand how the government represents global affairs? Now, if you were in this situation, pretty quickly you would run into an issue. As you would try and verify one source, let's say the social media infographics, you would realize that you can't get around the problem. Any possible means of verification is itself a representation created by the government which you don't currently trust. Therefore, as you accumulate information about how the government represents global affairs, that's all that you're doing. You're just understanding how the government represents the world, but you're not understanding the world itself. You understand their curated statistical representations, their verbal testimonies, and so on. The key point is, the information you're getting at is not capable of directly acquainting you with the state of the world. Now, this might not seem like too earth-shattering of an observation, but this is just an analogy. For philosophers like Schopenhauer and Kant, Their concern was that the relation that our sensory and mental faculties bear to the external environment is analogous to the relation of Mr. Curious to global affairs. In other words, just as Mr. Curious can only understand global affairs through a middleman, the government, I can only understand the world as it's presented to me through a middleman, my senses. In both cases, no matter how hard the subject, myself or Mr. Curious, tries to understand the object in itself, the best we can do is accumulate information about representations. In the same way as government-monitored news indirectly acquaint Mr. Curious with worldly events, Schopenhauer and Kant believe that our mental faculties indirectly acquaint us with the world. Fittingly, Schopenhauer calls our typical experience of the world, quote-unquote, the world as representation. It is also frequently referred to as the phenomenal world or the world of appearances. According to this view, no amount of knowledge about representations can ever penetrate beyond representations into the thing in itself. Now, I know that this is still fairly abstract, so I want to try and make the idea a little bit clearer. Right now, you're having a certain experience. Now, what is the content of that experience? You'll realize that almost all of it is sensory. You're seeing a bunch of visual stimuli with your eyes, including this video. You're hearing auditory information, like my voice. You may even physically feel the world. For example, your butt on the chair or your feet on the ground. This experience is built out of various senses, and these senses constitute the primary way that you're acquainted with the world. If we think in terms of our news analogy, each sense could be thought of as a particular source of news. As such, each sense has its job in representing the world to us according to what's practical, but importantly, not what's objectively true. Just as no amount of infographics can tell Mr. Curious the complete, objective, unmediated truth about the world, no amount of sense data will bring me to the truth about, say, this water bottle. My eyes present me with one story, my sense of touch presents me with another story, and if I drop it or hit it, my ears present me with yet another story. Each sense represents the water bottle in a particular way for me. However, just as the government's infographics filter out most information to create a coherent narrative that serves the government's aims, our sensory faculties filter out the vast majority of information in order to create a coherent experience that serves nature's aims, survival and reproduction. Likewise, just as Mr. Curious can't get around his problem to learn about the world itself, we can't get around our problem. We are incapable, according to this view, of understanding the world in itself. In other words, the world unmediated by sensory representation. To reiterate, the key point is this. The nature of mental faculties, whether sensory or conceptual, is that they mediate our access to the world, but they don't put us in direct acquaintance with it. I have no way of mentally apprehending this water bottle other than via representation. This means there's no way of understanding the water bottle in itself. While this isn't a problem for understanding water bottles, as nobody's that interested in them, if you're a philosopher or you're a scientist and you're concerned with things like the objective truth about the world, this limitation, our inability to get beyond representations, presents a major hurdle. As Schopenhauer notes, representations leave something to be desired. He says, quote, "We are not satisfied with knowing that we have representations, that they are such and such, and that they are connected according to this or that law. However much we may investigate, we obtain nothing but images and names. We are like a man who goes round a castle looking in vain for an entrance, and sometimes sketching the facades." End quote. The question for Schopenhauer is this: how can we get beneath the representation? Where is the entrance to his analogous castle? How can Mr. Curious learn about global affairs itself? Okay, sorry, I think I'm done with that analogy. It doesn't hold up any further anyways. Schopenhauer begins his answer to this problem with a hint. He says, quote, "We can never get at the inner nature of things from without." By from without, he is referring to observation and examination of the external world through our senses. This limitation is because, as already mentioned, our experience of the external world is necessarily representational. He goes on to explain that there is, however, a window beyond the representational. This is in virtue of the fact that we are not merely subjects seeking understanding of an external world. No. Rather, we are part of the world. We are a part of the same world that we're trying to understand. Therefore, by understanding oneself, we may uncover knowledge of the whole. Now, really quick, I'm going to review a couple of things before we move forwards. We've explained that all experiences of the external world are representational, mediated by our various sensory faculties. The issue is that no amount of representations can shed light on what the thing in itself is, on what the thing beneath the representations is. Now that we understand everything so far, we can elaborate upon Schopenhauer's proposed solution to this problem. For Schopenhauer, introspection, the process of looking inwards and gaining insight into our inner nature, is the key to this puzzle. According to Schopenhauer, introspection facilitates access to internal processes that are not, by their nature, representational. This introspection into our inner nature for Schopenhauer is direct. It is unmediated by our mental faculties. In other words, the experience of our inner nature transcends representation, giving us a glimpse into the thing in itself. To reiterate, Schopenhauer believes that introspection provides the sole way of accessing the thing in itself, provided that it is a direct, unmediated form of self-observation. He notes, for example, that when we introspect on the movement of our hand, we experience our hand in two distinct ways. Now, I want you to try this with me. As I move my hand around, there's one sense in which I experience it as a plain old object, an object in the world. That's just plain old representation. Now, in this sense, I'm aware of my hand in the same way I might be aware of anyone else's hand. However, Schopenhauer also notes another way in which we're made immediately and intuitively aware of our hand's movement. Besides this representation of our hand as an object in the world like any other, we are also directly acquainted with the hand's action. Schopenhauer writes that, quote, "The body is given in two entirely different ways. It is given an intelligent perception as representation, as an object among objects, but it is also given in a quite different way, namely, as what is known immediately to everyone and is denoted by the word will." It follows for Schopenhauer that this will we find within us, in virtue of being the sole part of our experience that is not representational, must be the sought-after thing in itself. He writes, quote, "Besides the will and the representation, there is absolutely nothing known or conceivable for us. If, therefore, the material world is to be something more than our mere representation, we must say that it is what we find immediately within ourselves as will." In other words, we know that there is some thing in itself beyond representation, as otherwise there would be nothing to represent. The trouble, as already mentioned, is identifying and knowing anything about this thing in itself. However, as there is nothing other than representation and thing in itself, anything which is not representation must be, by elimination, the thing in itself. Therefore, since the will is not representation, it follows that the will is the thing in itself. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, okay, Schopenhauer, so there's this will which I can directly experience when I move my hand, and you want to claim that this will is the thing in itself. So what? Aren't you just renaming the thing in itself? To this, Schopenhauer might agree that he's giving the in itself a name, but he would say that he's doing so for good reason, namely that he's correctly identifying the in itself. In fact, Schopenhauer would respond that there's actually a fair amount that we can uncover about this will and thus discover about the in itself through introspection. However, to get there, we're going to have to wait until part 2 of the series. Schopenhauer's insights on the will and how the will relates to suffering and morality are some of the most forceful ideas I've ever come across in my time studying philosophy. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you have any questions at all, please leave them in the comment section below, and I hope to see you back for episode 3.